Konnichiwa manpakusetachi. I am Puppy-sensei, the puppy girl Japanese teacher VTuber who makes Japanese language content to help you level up your abilities. Let's continue our discussion of Godan verbs from last week. I realize this is still a very introductory topic, but again, it's always my hope that I'm able to break these concepts down to the smallest possible degree to help you as you grow with your set of knowledge in the Japanese language. To review, modern Japanese has three classes of verbs, which I will be calling ichidan verbs, godan verbs, and irregular verbs. You may also hear ichidan verbs called type 2 verbs, and you may hear godan verbs called type 1 verbs. Whatever you call them, godan verbs honestly make up the largest number of Japanese verbs, so it's very important that we really develop a deep understanding of what exactly they are, how they conjugate, and how to use them in a sentence. Arguably, the verb in Japanese is the most important element of any sentence. Japanese is a language that allows you to drop the subject if you want. You may not need an object, but it's difficult to have a Japanese sentence without a verb. Godan verbs come in the following flavors. Godan verbs are going to basically end in any of these syllables. U, tsu, ru, ku, gu, bu, mu, nu, or su. Notice, obviously, that all of these end in an U vowel sound, and that's because all dictionary verbs end in an U sound, of course. Last time, we focused heavily on the verb nomu. This verb means to drink, nomu. And we said that nomu is the dictionary form, that is the casual non-past. Nomimasu is the polite non-past. The casual past tense would be nonda, I drank, and the polite past is nomimashita. But as you can see from this list, knowing what to do with godan verbs that end in mu really is only going to tell you a small bit of the overall story. It doesn't give us enough information to know how to conjugate these verbs. We need to understand how to handle the other types of these godan verbs as well. Now, fortunately, when it comes to the polite forms, that's actually not so bad. We already know that any godan verb is going to be put into the mas form or the mashita form. When it needs to do so, it's going to have to change to an E sound from an U sound. So nomu becomes nomimasu. Nomu becomes nomimashita. Mu becomes mi. The U sound becomes an E sound, and then we add the appropriate either non-past or past tense polite ending. This will actually be true for all godan verbs, so honestly, we can go ahead and fill out a lot of the rest of this information right away without thinking too much about it, right? I know that this is a lot to throw at you at once. I hope it makes sense. What we're seeing in this chart is basically that in any case, regardless what the godan verb ends with, it's going to need to convert into an E sound before we add mas or mashita, right? And so tsu would become chi, ru would become ri, ku would become ki, and so on and so on and so on. Whatever the final consonant plus vowel sound is, we're going to change that vowel to an E while preserving the consonant sound. And then we're going to add mas or mashita. So a verb like ao, to meet, becomes aimasu. U becomes E, and we add mas. Note, however, that I've added an asterisk here because I really want you to kind of take great care with verbs that end in just the U with no consonant. Sometimes I notice students getting confused with these types of verbs, and then they try to over-conjugate. For example, tsukao is a verb that ends in U. Tsukao means to use. Often I see students making the mistake of thinking that they need to conjugate tsukao into tsukimasu. This is wrong, but it isn't difficult to see why people make this mistake. Newer learners of Japanese may hypercorrect because they don't immediately see a consonant in front of u, leading to the mistake of backtracking too far and ending up trying to conjugate tsukau, to use, into tsukimasu. The correct conjugation of tsukau should be gaimasu. Gaimasu. The takeaway here is that we need to be careful when a verb ends just in that u hiragana. Remember, u becomes i. So ao becomes aimasu, kao becomes kaimasu, iu becomes imasu. The other important small caveat that I put here is for Godan verbs that end in ru. Honestly, I think I'm going to do a whole lesson on this topic just because it is incredibly tricky. So we are going to revisit this on another video at some point, probably not next week, but that doesn't matter. It'll come eventually. Anyway, for today, what I want you to understand is this basic, if unfortunate fact. Not all verbs that end in ru are ichidan verbs. Taberu ends in ru. It's an ichidan verb. Fukuru, a verb that means to make, also ends in ru. It's a Godan verb, not an ichidan verb. When we conjugate taberu, we get tabemasu, right? With taberu, we just drop the ru and we add mas. But when we conjugate tsukuru, we cannot just drop the ru and add mas like we did with taberu. Tsukumasu is not the correct conjugation for tsukuru in the mas form. It should be gurimasu. Gurimasu, that is the correct conjugation, right? How do we tell which verbs end in ru and are Godan verbs, and which verbs end in ru and are ichidan verbs? As I said, let's cover that in a future lesson. So, now we're left to fill out the rest of our chart. And what we need to do at this point is to cover the plain past forms of all of these Godan verbs. I'm not saying that they are extremely difficult, but they aren't really intuitive. So let's go through kind of one by one. Godan verbs that end in u are going to get conjugated into the ta, which is a small tsu plus ta form when we put them in the plain past. So ao becomes atta. Make sure that you have that pause in there. Atta, right? So a, small tsu, ta. Iu, to say, becomes itta. Machigau, to make an error, becomes machigatta. Notice how different this is from the nda ending that we learned for Godan verbs that end in mu, right? Nomu becomes nonda, but kao, which ends in an u sound, becomes katta. It's not at all the same as the nda ending, right? Okay, so tsu verbs and ru verbs are actually going to follow this same pattern. That means that a verb like tatsu, to stand, will become tatta in the plain past. And the verb tsukuru, to make, which we talked about previously, is going to become tsukutta in the plain past. These three Godan verb ending styles, u, tsu, and ru, all form sort of a subset that they're all basically going to follow a very similar conjugation pattern. And similarly, Godan verbs that end in ku and gu will also sort of fall into a similar pattern. Verbs that end in ku, like aruku, to walk, aruku, is going to become itta in the plain past. So aruku becomes aruita, aruita. Basically, you're adding an E sound to the stem, and then you add a ta sound after that E sound, right? The ku gets dropped completely, right? You don't have to recreate the ku or the k sound when aruku becomes aruita. A verb that ends in gu is going to follow a very, very, very similar pattern. It's just going to become ida instead of ita, right? So something like oyogu, to swim, would become oyoida, oyoida, right? The G sound is getting lost completely. But we're still making sure that we kind of bring over the dakuten from the gu and recreate that in the da in the end of oyoida. Bu, mu, and nu verbs are all going to form their own subset as well, all taking the nda ending as their plain past, right? So asobu, to play, becomes asonda, asonda. Yomu, to read, becomes yonda, read, I read it. Shinu, to die, becomes shinda. Ne? So all of these are taking an nda kind of ending. You may wonder why the mu and nu verbs are taking da when there's no dakuten in mu and nu. That's basically just because the sound and the sound kind of lend us to a d much more than a t. And then there was one more. Su verbs. And thankfully, verbs that end in su are very sensible. The su just conjugates into a shi sound, and then we add ta, right? So the verb is becoming shita, just like korosu becomes koroshita. I killed. I saved the easiest one for last, right? So su becomes shita. This is relatively straightforward, I think. But before we're done, some verbs don't play nice. As an example, iku. Iku, to go. So devious. It seems like such a simple word. Here's the conjugation pattern for iku. Iku, and then in the plain past, ita. And then in the polite, ikimasu and ikimashita. But take careful note of what happens in the plain past, right? If iku were like any other verb that ends in ku, it would take an ita ending, and not a small tsu plus ta ending. But if it took an ita ending, then the plain past would be ita. Ita, but that's not correct. What we get instead is ita. Ita, because that sounds better. The lesson? Sometimes verbs don't follow the rules because it sounds weird when they do, and so they don't because it sounds better. That was a bit of a longer lesson today, but I hope you found it helpful. I'll see you soon. また来週!